G'day there. There are some aspects of landscape photography which are quite easy to pick up. Things like what camera settings to use and what accessories you can use with your camera. There are other parts of landscape photography that require a little bit more effort. Things like making sure that you are up and early and avoid hitting that snooze button so that you're on location before the sun rises. Then there are the aspects of landscape photography which are quite challenging to learn, and we're going to deal with one of those in this video. What makes a great landscape image? This video is sponsored by Squarespace, so if you need a website, a domain or an online store, make your next move with Squarespace and use the discount code Andrew Marr. Landscape photography is an art form, so it can be difficult to break down exactly what makes a good or great landscape image. As with any art, it's quite subjective and up to interpretation. Having said that, this doesn't make it very easy for anybody who is just learning about landscape photography or is wanting to improve the landscape images they're taking. And that's who this video is for. There are several ways to break down what makes a great landscape image. When I'm capturing or editing an image, I often do so with the person who's going to look at my photo in mind. How do I want the image to impact the viewer? So I've come up with 4 principles that you can apply to the photos that you take to help you understand what makes a great landscape picture so that you can take better images. The first is to grab the viewer's attention with some initial interest, and the obvious way to do this is using colour. If you have 1 or 2 bold colours in your image, it'll stand out and catch the viewer's eye. This is why colourful sunrises and sunsets are so popular, because the colours attract people's attention. There are other ways to include this initial interest in your photo, using things like textures, simple shapes, and appealing curves in your image. It's not only about what elements you have in your frame, but more importantly, how they're composed. In this image of some sand dunes, the initial colours that you'll see are the pink and blue hues in the sky. While there are some textures in the sand, the more prominent features are the simple shapes of the dunes that are created with the composition and the appealing curve created by the ridge of the dune. Have a look at some of your own landscape photos and ask yourself what grabs your attention when you first look at the image. It doesn't always have to be the main subject. Think about how you could tweak the composition to emphasise that initial interest. Perhaps move the camera closer to the object in the foreground with the texture to bring out more of the detail. Plenty of photographers apply this principle when they use a telephoto lens to zoom in and capture just a part of a scene. They're simplifying the composition and often grab the viewer's eye with simple shapes or lines that they find within the landscape. This approach can be really effective. The next principle is to now draw the viewer into the image. And again, this relies heavily on the composition that you've set up. There's pretty much 2 things you want to do here. You want to create a composition that guides the eye of the viewer into the image, and at the same time avoid objects or lines that might interrupt any pathways that have been set up for the eye to follow and end up being distracting for the viewer. If the experience of moving from one part of the image to another is easy and intuitive, the photo is pleasing to the eye and it encourages the viewer to further explore the picture. Using leading lines is a common way of guiding the viewer's eye, but there are several other compositional strategies that you can use to do this, like setting up framing, using layers within a scene, or including an interesting foreground. A little while ago, I did a video on effective composition strategies that you can check out if you're interested. I'll leave a link in the description below. Go back to your own images and identify how the viewer is being drawn into the scene that you've captured. Where is the eye being guided? How could you adjust the composition to make these pathways easier to follow and therefore your image more appealing? Are there any distractions that potentially pulls the viewer's attention away or breaks the flow of your photo? The third principle is to create a connection through a story. Some photographers like to focus on the connection that they have with the location that they're shooting, but I like to think a little bit differently about this and work out how I can create a connection between the viewer and the landscape I've captured. I do this by communicating to them what was in the scene and try and transport them into a location that they may not have been to before. This connection is created by telling a story of the landscape through the image. Some people get stuck on this concept of a story about a landscape, but it's not a story in the traditional sense. A story of the landscape is simply the elements in the scene, like the rocks, the water, or the sunlight, and how they interact. In other words, how the water crashes over the rocks, how the sunlight reflects off the surface of the water or off the side of the mountain. A landscape's story doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, simple stories are often very engaging. However, as with any story, it's not just what the story is about, but it's how well the story is told. And again, that comes down to the composition. Storytelling in a landscape photo is the composition. How the elements in the scene relate to each other comes down to the composition. How the scene is revealed and how the viewer is moved through the scene comes down to an effective composition. Last year I did a video on how to find and tell the story of a landscape. I'll leave a link in the description below so you can check that out. The easiest and best way to get better at storytelling is to have a look at how others tell stories through their photos and to practice telling stories through your own photos. So check out some of the images you enjoy from other photographers and take a look at how they've composed the scene. How have they arranged the elements to relate to each other? And how has the scene been revealed to you? Notice how your eye moves through the image and work out how the composition has helped do this. Before I share the last principle on what makes a great landscape image, I just want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you're like me, you want to spend as much time as possible getting out and shooting landscapes. The last thing I want to do is spend hours setting up and maintaining a website, and that's where Squarespace really shines through for me. It's very easy to set up and maintain a website with Squarespace, and I had it done in no time. You first select from one of their gorgeous templates, some of which have been designed specifically with photographers in mind, and then you start creating pages. Each time you create a page, you can choose from one of their suggested layouts and then customize things from there. And of course, this speeds up the process. You can drag and drop your content around where you want it, no need for any coding. The whole process is very, very simple. Other than updating my content, I barely spend any time on my website because Squarespace handles anything from hosting through to managing all of the platform updates. So I can spend all of my time getting out and taking more landscape images. You can check them out at squarespace.com, where you can start your free trial today. And then once you have your website set up and you're ready to launch, make sure you go to squarespace.com/Andrew Marr to get 10% off your first purchase. The final principle of a great landscape image goes beyond sharing what could be seen and starts to share or capture the feeling of a location. By conveying some of the mood of the scene, the landscape photo becomes more compelling. Now, just to be clear here, we're not talking about everything that a photographer may have felt while they were out on location, because I imagine there's mixed emotions that could be felt. But by including some aspect of the mood or emotion within an image, you elevate the impact that an image has on the viewer. Examples of moods reflected in an image can come from things like shafts of sunlight piercing through the clouds, or alternatively the colder, darker mood of storm clouds rolling in over the scene. Colour is another powerful element that you can utilise when building an emotion. The oranges of the setting sun over the energy of the crashing waves, or the cool, relaxing blue and green tones of a calm, secluded beach. How these elements are finally interpreted by the viewer is, of course, up to the individual. But importantly, the layers of interest that you're creating makes the image more engaging. Think back to when you saw an image that evoked an emotion within you. What was it about the image that elicited this reaction? Look at some of your own images and identify which ones communicate the feeling or mood of the location. The more you become aware of this, the easier it is to include emotion and mood in your images. So there are the 4 principles that make up a great landscape image. Now, I just want to make a couple of quick points before we finish up on the video. A good landscape image doesn't necessarily have to apply all of the 4 principles equally. There'll be some styles and some landscape images that just naturally apply 1 or 2 of the principles quite strongly, and they still make great landscape images. My approach is to have these principles in mind as I'm working out how to improve the image that I'm capturing. I apply them to every aspect of my photography, from planning trips through to observing the scene when I'm out on location. You can see throughout this video just how much the principles are impacted by the composition that you find. So it's helpful to consider these when you're working out what elements to include and how to arrange them in your image. These principles are being applied when I'm selecting the camera settings as well as when I'm editing the final image. But that's a discussion for another video. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please give this video a like. The best way to support the channel is to share this video with anybody who you think might find it helpful. I hope your next photography trip is just around the corner so you can shoot some more landscapes and perhaps put some of these principles into practice. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.